Okay, well, looks like we have a couple guests. Last week, what we covered was a series of questions about if authority is directing others towards some good. That's what I'm arguing in the case is what authority is. It's the power or the ability to direct others. Then we need to know, how do people or things move? And so what we settled on was that humans move in two ways. One, they are either moved passively from external things like being pushed, and they also are agents in the sense that they use self-determination, they use choice, they use their ability to choose this thing or to choose that thing. And if that is the case, then the question becomes, well, how do you exercise authority over someone if they if in their mind they cannot be controlled? If they can't be controlled in their mind, in their choices, how do you exercise authority? Well, what we discussed was that authority then is primarily persuasion. That is primarily the way that we see authority used, not always force, but primarily persuasion, because you cannot force the mind, you can only persuade the mind. You can force the body, you can compel the body, but you cannot force and compel the mind. So what we'll be talking now is to do kind of an overview, a very brief overview, before we jump into some of these details with a little bit more detail. Here's this pen. So what sphere is under our authority? That's one of the questions we asked last time, or what domain is under our authority or our control? And what is it? Someone tell me. What sphere is under every individual's authority?
Ourselves.
Yes, but what specifically?
Mind?
Your choices. Yes, your choice, your assent. Because ultimately, you're actually not fundamentally in control of your body, because someone could come and take your body and put you in chains and drag you away. Right? So, yes, we do have an authority over our body, but it's not guaranteed, because something could happen to your body. Something could happen to you passively. And we are morally responsible for those things which are under our authority and within our control. So this is going to be really important when we think about responsibility. If you're in authority, we are morally responsible for those things which are under our authority and within our control. And those things which we aren't, well, we are not responsible for. So I'm going to diagram this just to make it really clear as I can make it. When it comes to every individual in this room, you have a circle, an inner circle, which will put assent, like assenting to something. We also get the word consent. Choice. What other words could we put in there? Deliberation. Deliberation. Can you guys see this? If you can't see it, it's not my fault. You're too far away. So that's within the mind. Now, outside of the mind, we have our body. That's a pretty big body. Maybe we should make it smaller.
Are you fat shaming?
No. Don't want to shame myself. Okay. So, in terms of causality, remember we talked about what's the principle of motion in us? Well, animals, the principle of motion is fundamentally other things. Even though the way that you would describe it is like movement coming from outside and then coming in. But that's not the case for humans. Humans, we have inputs from sensory experience, from things outside of us, but fundamentally our principle of action is ourselves, from within, the intellect. This is what fundamentally makes us different from animals, all other animals. This is fundamentally what makes us unique. If you lose this, then you're not. When we talk about something being irrational, losing their mind, acting like an animal, it's because they're not fundamentally using assent, choice, and deliberation. Now, when we talk about others around us, so we had another person over here, and they've got the same thing. They've got assent. Are you guys able to see that? No. Maybe I'll put it up high. There's a reason I have them in a certain order. Okay, assent, choice, deliberation, self-determination. Now, the question becomes, like we discussed last time, how do you move others towards the good? Well, when, for example, this is your employee. Oh, sure, yeah. Actually, we'll turn it around. Yeah. Okay. So, when it comes to other rational beings, they are also, this domain, the sphere is outside of our control, fundamentally. You cannot get in someone's mind and force them to agree to something or to force them to assent to something. Otherwise, it simply wouldn't be assent. It simply wouldn't be choice. That's the definition of choice. It's the definition of assent, is that it's something that is done by oneself and it's not been done by another. So if we're talking about authority, when it comes to exercising authority over others, fundamentally, we're going to make this authority, we'll extend it to include this person. But fundamentally, it only includes the body. It doesn't fundamentally include the mind. Now, there are going to be relations of authority where it doesn't include the body, or it only includes certain aspects of the body. For example, if you work at a certain restaurant, you have to wear a certain kind of clothing. That's a controlling of your body. You're voluntarily agreeing, if you're going to work here, you need to wear this. If you're going to work here, you need to do this when you're in this premises. You can't do this. So to come into that relation, you are voluntarily agreeing, and now this part of your body is in some sense being forced. Insofar as you want to resist that, well, you can find your way to the exit. So when we talk about other kinds of people that are under authority, you could take, for example, a child. Let me just draw the principles of action. So the principle is moving outwards to the body to make us move, to go this way, to go that way, and then onto others. And this can be drawn primarily is going to be by persuasion for others. Now, but for a child, this is where things get a little bit more complicated, because a child doesn't have fully, doesn't have the full breadth of capacities of reasoning that adults hold. And there's, many reasons for this, and we see this, for example, in the reason why we have consent laws. A 3-year-old can't consent to sex, right? It's not consensual sex. Yet, for some reason in our culture, we think a 3-year-old can consent to changing their gender. But we fundamentally believe that children, in some sense, don't have the same thing on the inside as adults fully developed do. And that's, we can debate all about the specifics of that. That's totally fine. People are going to have disagreements over what is in there in terms of the child's mind. But what we do know is that children fundamentally don't have the same kinds of capacities as adults do. As a seed grows to a tree tree doesn't have the fruit. Another tree has the fruit, but the seeds don't have the fruit. They have to develop that. And that's, sometimes we hear the word riper, to be riper. Like in our confession, it uses that language, that image of seed to full grown. So now the authority in this case, once again, comes from deliberation, assent, choice, goes outward to the child, but it envelops it not primarily on the basis of persuasion. If you have children, I have 4, persuasion, and this is a scale. This is not an absolute, there's not a line in the sand. This is on a scale. The younger the child is, the less they are able to be persuaded of something. And even the older the child is, the more often their persuasion is not necessarily based upon reason, it's all based upon pleasure or desire or fleeing pain. So like, if you want to do this, do you want to have that? Yes. Why? Because they really want that thing. But not because they've determined for themselves that thing in itself is a good for them. So when you're exercising authority over a child, we have to take into account that they are, in many ways, not capable of thinking about and thinking through the things that we are able to in terms of helping them move towards their good. And that's why, for example, Theodore was sick this week, he had thrown up, and we were at the store, he threw up, we came home, and we get home, he's really hungry. What does he want to do? He wants to eat. He really wants to eat. He started pestering, I want to eat, I want to eat. I told him, Theodore, if you eat, you're going to throw up. You cannot eat. No, I want to eat, I want to eat. He doesn't connect the fact that he threw up with the fact that if he eats more, it's going to disturb his tummy. Even if you explain it, try and break it down, just pestering, I want to eat, I want to eat, I want to eat. Okay, fine, in 1 hour, I will give you a cracker, right? But he's not able to think. So in that sense, I'm resisting his will. In fact, his will doesn't, his ability to have food, if it was up to him, he would have it. But in this sense, he's being forced to not have food. It's being withheld from him. And there's just all kinds of examples throughout my day when I'm going through, and you just see they aren't connecting the dots in terms of the implications. And that's because they don't understand, they don't have understanding. Let me move along here. They don't have knowledge. So knowledge is a capacity to explain why something is the case or to know something is the case. So if you have knowledge of some specific topic, you're able to delineate it from other things. Then you're able to say what it's for. You're able to give some kind of rational account for it. So for example, I asked you guys, what's this in my hand? Pardon? Oh, a marker. Yeah, and I asked you, okay, what's it for? What kind of writing? Whiteboard, right? On the whiteboard. Now, a child that takes this in their hand and is not given discipline and instruction, they think this is a chew on it, put it on your mouth, put it in your eye, like literally lick it, like this is food, draw it on the walls. No, when we see this, we recognize that this has a specific purpose, a specific telos, to which we are to use it. And we can explain the reason why this is the case, this thing is the case, is for the goal of writing. When you're a child, for example, to give one more example, there's one very distinct memory I have at our old home. We're walking along the path, and Theodore asks, why is there the playground? We're walking past the playground. Why is there the playground? Why is the playground there? And it's the kind of question which is like, it's a desire for knowledge, but even the question itself is not properly formulated. That's not the kind of question we would ask. I mean, I explained to Wilby so we could play, but he doesn't have the ability at this point yet to maybe even ask the right kind of questions, or he doesn't know how to formulate it in such a way that is indicative of someone who's able to gain wisdom. And the wise person is the one who is able to have knowledge of causes and effects. Why is something the case? Why do you so here's a good example. Who likes to bake? Bake, okay. Is baking a science or like more of an art?
I mean,
It's a science.
every art has to have science.
Okay, I know, but for the sake of, yeah. So there is it's a science. Now you can come in here and you can take your recipe book and you just literally follow it to a T, right? Now, do you use baking soda, baking powder?
Self-raising flour.
Yeah, self-raising flour. Okay. For someone who doesn't have wisdom about baking, they don't know why these things are in the recipe. All they know is that they got to follow it. If they follow this list of things, they're going to get this result, right? And they might know, okay, if I screw it up, then it's gonna turn out well. A wise person understands why something is the case. Why is this ingredient in there? Well, what does baking soda do? I don't know. I'm not into baking. I'm not a scientist. I did do chemistry. Someone could probably in the room tell me what baking soda is for. But that's just one small example of knowledge. Yeah?
Yeah, so is this discussing the capability to gain knowledge, or is this speaking of the knowledge that one has full stop? Because regarding, for example, the pen analogy, if a child was given a really lengthy explanation, and let's say basically instead of trying to learn the basics of multiplication, they instead learns about what a pen is, they probably would be able to say, this is what a pen is for, right?
Yeah.
Like, so in that example, is this talking about a child's access to reason? Is this about their capability of gaining, or is this simply what they know? Because I could take a Siberian farmer and give them a nuclear launch key, and they would probably also try and use it to
Yeah, it's about both.
Okay.
Fundamentally about both. And this is why, this is the reason why children fundamentally, this is actually not what we're supposed to be talking about, but this is why no, this is actually, I'm taking us here. This is why fundamentally children, when it comes to the exercise of authority is primarily in the domain of force, involuntary force, because a child, you cannot reason to a child I'm not speaking about everyone. I have very little young children, but when Theodore wants something, he cannot be reasoned to want something else. There are sometimes, yes, I'm starting to see that now, okay, but oftentimes he himself is not thinking that way. His desires overcome what is good, what is fundamentally good. What he perceives to be good is not what's good for him. He wants the food now. Well, yeah, usually food is good for you. That's usually the case. But right now, it's not. Why is that the case? Well, let me try and explain it to you. But his ability to even grasp that sickness means that you'll throw up, it's difficult. So knowledge is the capacity to explain something, why something is the case. To know something on account of authority, because of authority, is a kind of knowledge that we call opinion, trust, or faith. And this is not to be confused with saving faith. When we are going through our confession, we'll be talking about saving faith and likely how that's different from other kinds of faith or trust. And an example of this is they were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes. He taught with one as having wisdom in that case. Oh. Can you guys see that in the back? Okay. Now, when it comes to talking about, so there are two kinds of knowledge where we know on account of authority, where we're knowing something because of an authority. The first is speculative wisdom, which is concerned with necessary and eternal truths. These things are not open to opinion, open to debate. They are demonstrated through arguments, through rational demonstrations. An example of this is pi. Now, how many people in this room know why 3.14159 equals pi? How many people know why? We have one person, Ian, and maybe. So you don't actually have knowledge. Everyone in this room has fundamentally faith when it comes to this symbol equals 3.14159. One of my friends made that his garage door entry key code, so I learned that number because of that. But we believe that on account of faith. We don't have true knowledge because we don't know why that is the case. We don't understand why it is the case or how it is the case. And so we are believing it on account of an authority. Good authority has told us that is the case, and we believe it, and we accept it. And if you want to say, well, I just reject this authority, okay, fine. Stop using your calculator because, thankfully I'm well gone and past that phase. Some people here are still doing math for fun. The second kind of knowledge is practical wisdom, which we call prudence, and it's concerned with contingent actions that could be otherwise through deliberation. So notice the difference. One is necessary and one is contingent. So that 3.14 is what pi equals, is necessary and eternal. That's going to be the case whether you're in Calcutta or whether you're in Orkney, Scotland, or whether you're in Brazil. It doesn't matter. It's going to be that case that way everywhere. And 3,000 years ago, 10,000 years in the future, whatever, it's going to be the case. This is an eternal truth, in that sense, a necessary truth. And it can be just demonstrated. Whereas practical wisdom, which involves prudence, involves contingent things that could be otherwise. So I'm going to give some examples of those. But those are the contingent things that could be otherwise, which we have to deliberate about. So everyone in this room is required to use prudence, and unfortunately most of the time, due to the fall, due to sin, due to total depravity, we get this often really wrong. We fail to deliberate well about contingent things. So prudence is right reason applied to action. So right reason, which involves eternal truths up here, and they're applied to action. Now, if you're knowing something on account of an authority in this case, it's to say you don't know why you should read your Bible. Let me ask this question. When should you do Bible time, and for how long? How long? Now, someone might say, well, my pastor told me I should do it for 15 minutes a day, and I should do it every day. Now, you're believing that on account of an authority, but you don't know it for yourself. And so that's the difference between doing something on account of an authority where you've versus you actually using your reasoning, right, over here, reasoning about it, and then applying that reasoning to your action, to your actual activity, to you doing something. So now when it comes to the responsibility of, that's not supposed to be like that. That authority is supposed to be outside of the box. The responsibility of the one who is in authority, when it comes to prudence, that's what we're talking about, actually. Yeah. The goal, what it has to do is they have to have an end in mind, and they have to have a means to the end. So prudence involves ends, and it involves means. We use the same language for means when it comes to means of grace, right? How do you receive the grace? Well, through various means, through the Lord's Supper, through the sacraments, through baptism, etc. So the end goal in any given situation is the end goal, the task that you're trying to achieve. You have to have that in mind, and you have to know whether it's possible. If it's impossible, it's not the kind of thing that you can do. You use prudence on. So, for example, you want to become a dragon. That can't be a goal because that's just not possible, right? Or you want to win the lottery. Okay, in a very limited sense, it's possible, but effectively it's impossible. Okay? So that's the kind of thing, though, that people dream about, but they really shouldn't be dreaming about because it's not within their power. Yeah?
But if you require a understanding of what the end you're seeking for before you understand the means to an end, how do you know it's impossible?
Well, because part of the reasoning capacity is the first stage is just determining your end and whether it's something that's actually possible.
But to determine if it's actually possible, that requires an understanding of the means.
Yes, so you do have to go through that process of determining whether you're able even to achieve it before you reject that as a goal. So the person who's in authority, if you're a father, if you're a husband, if you're a teacher, if you're an elder, if you're a person in this room who has to exercise prudence over your own life, authority over your own self, right? Then you need to set yourself ends. You set yourself ends, and you have to find means. So the first phase is inquiry, which is deliberating and taking counsel about the possible means to achieving the end. And I'm going to give some examples. The next is to judge between these various options. Which specific means is the best in accordance with reason? Then the last thing, and this is the exercise of authority, when you're actually exercising it, is commanding oneself or others. You might use the word instructing, commanding, if commanding is too harsh, to make use of what one has deliberated and judged. So the command phase is using what has been inquired about and what one has judged to be the case. That is the exercise of authority. Now, we can talk about these different phases and how this relates to working with other people, with working with spouses, with children. But fundamentally, for someone who is in authority, in a position of authority, if they receive the ends and the means from one under their authority, as a principle of your action is to shirk responsibility and to defer authority. So what that means is to say, is if someone else does this for you, and you're the one in authority, they're the one that delivers to you the command about what to do. Determines what must be done, what is the best way to do it, and then you receive that, and then you say, okay, sure. Well, fundamentally, you're shirking responsibility and you're deferring authority, because authority and responsibility are tied together. Now, ultimately, before God and even before man, we cannot shirk our responsibilities. Even if you slough off the exercising of your authority to someone else, it's going to come back to get you. You see this in companies, in corporations, you see this in marriages. Fundamentally, it always comes back to the person who was supposed to have the authority to begin with. So let me give you some examples. Yeah?
What about the case of delegating authority?
So we'll talk about that. Yeah. So that would be an example of you have a goal. I want my children to be educated. Well, that's my goal for my children. My wife is with them, is at home, taking care of them. I'm delegating her the authority to choose which course book to use. So she can then go, knowing that this is the goal, say, okay, deliberate, here's the options, and make a judgment about what those things are. Now, fundamentally, what that should look like is not the husband just going off in aloof and just saying, oh, she decided, but fundamentally should, being reviewing the solutions together and then moving forward together. But that's what we'll talk about in terms of delegated authority. And just a quick note here. Prudence is the knowledge of what to seek and what to avoid. What to seek and what to avoid. And this pertains to goods. So directing other towards what goods are desirable and what evils are to be avoided. So let's get some examples, just so you can be thinking about how this is practical. So should you do family worship? And how many times a day? And for how long? Okay, so what do you think about that one?
Yes, it depends.
Okay. So break down where the yes is and where the depends is.
Say that the yes would be in the beginning. You should do family worship.
Mm-hmm.
How many times a day, for how long, depends on your circumstances and whatnot.
Yeah. So that requires prudence. It requires prudence because you are deliberating about giving your goal, which is the spiritual well-being of your family. That's the goal, that they might know God and worship Him. Not just leaving that to the church, but this is your personal responsibility as the one in authority, as the father. And it's also the personal responsibility of the mother over the children as well. I mean, there's still nonetheless a degree in that, but that is also a personal responsibility of the mother and authority of the mother. So when it comes to figuring out how many times a day works, that's going to depend on the family. So Abby often does family devotions with the kids at lunch. I, about 50% of the time, need to do it more, do Bible reading with the kids in the morning, and then we do Bible worship family every single night, except on Sunday nights, which is a decision we've made because we're at church all day, and that's a decision we made, a prudential decision we made, because by the time we get home, the kids need to get to bed. Some people haven't slept at all in the afternoon, so it's a prudential decision. It's not a command that we must worship for this long. Some people can do an hour-long Bible family worship time. Some people can't. People don't have that kind of time. Some people can only afford to do 15 minutes with their families. Some people, in a certain season of their life, may be only able to do it 3-4 nights a week. If there are specific extenuating circumstances, that is being prudent in that instances, and to force it to do otherwise, in that instance, may actually do harm, more harm than good. For example, someone who says that you must have family worship for an hour every single night, well, that could actually do more harm to the family than good. So we need to be prudent and to understand those aspects of those things that are under our authority in order to be prudent. For example, also, should you sing? We sing one hymn, typically one hymn every night with the hymnal that we have. But how many songs? Should you sing multiple? My point here is that in those cases, there's not a fixed universal law that you should sing a hymn every night. And to give you an indication of why this is the case, we're going to go back to this page. So this is a little small on the screen, I'm realizing now. But when it comes to determining what we ought to do, when we're using right reasoning about our life, we, we who are in authority, and everyone in this room, because we all ultimately have that self-determined aspect within ourselves, we have to take into account the divine law, which is over here, which is God's revelation of the just requirements to his church and to his people. And they are given in special revelation and recorded in Scripture. And so those three things come down to us in the Decalogue, which is the Ten Commandments, which we recite every Sunday, the judicial law, and the ceremonial law. So for someone that was living in ancient Israel, when it came to them making a prudential decision about what it means to have family worship, they're going to be considering these two things, whereas we aren't, given our context. If it were a necessary truth, if it were an eternal truth for all people, for all time, then we would all have to do that, but it's not. That doesn't fall into that category. Whereas for Christians today, in this day and age, we have what's called the natural law and the moral law. So the moral law are those things that are true and binding for all humans in all ages, for all history, because it is grounded in the natural law, the way God made us. It's a part of our nature. God's revelation, as it says there, inscribed on every heart with a basic knowledge of good and evil. And so from that flows the moral law, where we get the Decalogue, which is the Ten Commandments, and we get a couple of the laws. But let me start here. So what's the fourth commandment? You must, keep the Sabbath day, keep it holy. And we're also called to, in the first and second commandment, we're called to worship God, him alone, and not through, him alone. So when it comes to, for example, making a decision about how often one should have family worship, well, we're going to need to factor that in, right? So there's going to be certain songs that we can't sing, because certain songs more about us, right? Certain songs are. So there are aspects of this that we can't tinker with. But there are aspects of it that are contingent, that could be otherwise. That tonight we're singing a hymn, tomorrow night we're not. There might be a extenuating circumstance. Oh, your child starts throwing up all over, during family worship. Okay, family worship's only going to be 3 minutes tonight, because, given what might be the case in that particular circumstance. Here's another one: to sit in a circle for the Lord's Supper or not. That is a contingent reality. If the church gets a certain amount of size, we're going to have to reconsider how we're going to do this. That's contingent. It's not scientific. If it's scientific, then it couldn't be any other way. Should you discipline your children in front of each other or in private, behind closed doors? Right? When your children are together, is it right to discipline them in front of each other or not? That requires prudence. How often should you pray with your wife? Nightly? 2 times a day? Rent or buy a home? Big wedding or small wedding? Part-time work for 15 hours or for 25 hours? Which church should you attend? Date night, weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly? These are all examples of prudence, using prudence that affect other people. Let me do 2 others. Seeking to be healthy and getting a good grade in school. So for example, to take seeking to be healthy, if your goal, let's make seeking healthy be your goal, the end goal is to be healthy, okay? Now, there are certain things that one must do. So, okay, I'm going to have a diet, or maybe not a diet. I'm going to try and be physical activity outdoors. So you figure out what those things are you need to do, and then you need to judge, okay, I'm going to do this one, and then you need to command yourself. And if it's people in your family, if you're like, for example, I want my children to be more healthy, they are maybe spending too much time on screen or whatever, then you can use that exact same kind of reasoning for them, but it will obviously be different given their circumstances. And that's, in that case, you're using authority over them, because they themselves aren't being the ones getting to decide what to do. They're not the ones setting the goal. You're setting the goal, and you're the one deliberating about what must be done, and you're the one judging what must be done, and then you're the one that's actually forcing them to do it in the command phase there. Now, the one who shirks their authority says, we'll let the child set the goals in terms of their personal health. How's that going to turn out? There's a story I was reading on Yahoo like a couple years ago, and this child only ate Pringles and white bread and ham. And he died, I think, at 13 years old. He only ate that. He wouldn't eat anything else. If I remember the story right, I think he died. But like this is fundamentally what we're talking about is someone setting their own ends, a child setting their own ends. They are not capable of determining what is good for them, and then commanding themselves, and not just commanding themselves to do it, but then continuing in that command. And that's the part where we all struggle when it comes to things like health, or things like, how much time we spend on social media. It's not just commanding ourselves to do it, but then continuing with that decision. That requires character, that requires virtue, that requires the Holy Ghost to help us and give us grace. So, what time is it? 3:09. Okay. But there's often disagreement on what is good and the best way to achieve the good. So this can be the case between you and your children, between an elder and yourself, right? When it comes to speaking with an individual elder, between the church and the elder, between a husband and wife, an employee and an employer. Do you have a question? No. So if you're under authority, there's two options. Either you're to be persuaded or you're going to remain unpersuaded. The goal of the person in the authority is to persuade one towards that particular end. And before I say this, I got to back up before I'm misunderstood. And we can obviously talk about practical examples. Where's this? Okay, so when it comes to deliberating and taking counsel, someone say, what this means is that the husband just goes into his room or into a chamber, and he goes in there, and he makes a decision. He comes out and he lines up his wife and his children and then commands them, okay, go do this. That's not what I'm thinking about, and that's not, I think, what Scripture teaches, and I don't think that's prudent. What we're talking about here is, in the case of a husband and wife, is coming together, and your wife is a helpmate, as we see in Genesis. That's by God's design. For one to neglect the insight of their wife, the person who does that is a fool. You have a wife for a reason. They're a helpmate, just not with against children, but also with regards to deliberating about what is best. So we're to take counsel. We're not just to take counsel from our wives, we're supposed to take counsel from if you're an individual in this room and you don't take counsel from anybody else, that's a problem. You're a fool, right? If you're an elder and you don't take counsel from other elders or from other church elders from other churches, that's not wise. That's foolishness. You're going to end up in a headache. So there is safety in counsel, as the Proverbs say. And so when it comes to deciding what to do and what's the best way to achieve it, one should take counsel with their wife. One must do that. In a technical sense, I'm going to get myself in hot water. In a technical sense, one is not absolutely necessary, but for the sake of prudence, it is. If you want peace in the home, then speak with your wife. If you want the good of your wife and the good of your home, speak with your wife and take counsel together. And actually, Abby and I we just started doing this a couple months ago. We're not doing it consistently as we'd like to, but we have what's called our council chamber. And so what happens is if there's two things that could happen. Either Abby and I are having a disagreement over something in front of the kids. The kids are all around us playing, blah, blah, blah. A really bad habit we had was we'd actually just have that conversation in front of everybody. Even though it's just one-on-one, but the kids start acting out. They see that now we're getting a little bit heated. Or maybe it's about the kids. Maybe it's the way I discipline a child, or maybe the way I spoke to a child, or the way Abby did something. All of a sudden, we're having this conversation in front of them. And they're getting smarter. They're getting more understanding. So now they're able to recognize more and more what's going on. So we decided, we're going to have a council chamber where we need to call time out, go to the council chamber, have the conversation, and then that way we can decide, then a decision can be made about what's the best way forward on this particular case, or whether it needs to be shelved for when we have a discussion later on about the kids and about parenting them. Okay. So, an authority. Okay, understanding. So if you and your wife are trying to decide to buy a house, whether to rent or where to buy, as an example, and that's something probably you want to have full persuasion on, you want your wife to completely assent to the decision. Now, that's not going to be the case in every circumstance, but that would be the goal. So when it comes to understanding, they can understand why something is the case and why you have decided that this is best, why you've taken counsel together, you've talked about it, you've prayed about it, you've thought about where to go, and this is what you've decided to do. Someone who is unpersuaded are those who are under authority and who are not persuaded concerning the end or the means. So they may agree with the end, but may not agree with the means. They might say, yes, we should desire our kids to be more healthy, but they disagree that, I think our kids should be able to watch more TV, watch the same amount of TV that they are. I disagree with you that they shouldn't watch as much TV. That's not an example where Abby and I have disagreed with that. We're on the same page okay, on that, end and means. But what they must do is they must trust in that case. When the buck stops, there has to be a decision about what one must do. We cannot live in a state, as Aristotle says, of infinite deliberation. We must actually come to a point where we judge what must be done and then put into action that judgment. And so for someone who remains unpersuaded about either the end or the means, then there's a requirement for trust. So those who understand the ends and the means are morally responsible and act entirely voluntarily, if they understand both the ends and the means, because they understand what we're doing. They understand why we're doing it, right? Take, for example, someone up high up in someone in one of the doctors at the Nazi camps. They understand what's being done. They understand even the soldiers, right? We can go through and think about when it comes to moral responsibility, which we will do shortly if we have time. And they are acting voluntarily. Your wife or the employee or the child, in this case, would be acting voluntarily because they also desire that end. And they have understanding about why it is good for them. And thus, as a result of this, if you're persuaded by knowledge, you're also blamable and praiseworthy. So if something goes wrong, it turns out to be a really bad decision that, yes, the husband decided, but the wife fully agrees to and implements it, there is still blame that comes both onto the husband and onto the wife. There is also praise that comes both onto the husband and onto the wife. And this is fundamentally the place where we should aim to be at, which is complete agreement, a complete agreement when it comes to what the ends and means are. An authority should seek to persuade others, but the rational assent in absolutely difficult instances is not necessary. There are going to be times in our lives, if we are in authority, where we have to make a decision that the other person does not agree with, does not believe to be true. And this is also true when it comes to relationship with God, right? That's not really the focus of what we're talking about, but we can put this entire discussion in terms of relationship with God. God, why did this happen? I don't understand, right? I don't agree. Well, ultimately, we're all under God's authority. To trust an authority is to receive as your own the deliberation or judgment of that authority. So what it's doing is, when we talk about substitutionary atonement, for example, it's like Christ taking the suffering in our place, right? That's a kind of a substitution. In this case, it's kind of like it's a similar idea where the person under authority is assenting to having the decision of the other person. And hopefully in this case, there's agreement. The deliberation and the judgment are not your own, but you cling to receive them as if they were. That's what trusting in an authority is. In the case where you disagree or you don't understand. And trust is thus an imperfect knowledge. It's not the kind of knowledge that we talked about earlier, a more perfect knowledge of the understanding of why something is the case. And thus, there is an imperfect moral responsibility. The wife or the child or the employee or anybody who's under authority, if they don't fully understand why something is the case, they're also, in the same sense, not held to the same degree of moral responsibility. Does that make sense? Yes? I'm getting like 3 nods, okay. And then as a result of that, they're less blameworthy or blamable or praisable. Now, what I want to do is talk a bit about being under authority or having authority when it comes to knowledge with the remainder of time. Yeah?
In
Because it doesn't involve knowledge and desire. Now, what you might be, we can only say that you are agreeing to it only by virtue of the authority of the person, but you're not agreeing to it, the action in itself. So it's not an essential agreement, it's what we call technically accidental agreement. Because you don't understand, you wouldn't do it otherwise. Right? If it was left to you, you wouldn't do it. Okay, here's a quote. Actually, do we have time for the quote? No, we don't have time for the quote. Francis Turretin. You can see the quote later when it's put online. Invincible versus vincible ignorance. Thank you. So invincible ignorance is the kind of ignorance that you can't overcome. So if you're under an authority and they say to do this, and you do it, or just like in regular life, if we're doing something on the basis of ignorance that we couldn't have overcome, we are not morally responsible. This is the invincible versus vincible ignorance is a scholastic distinction. It's used by the Reformed thinkers as well for describing responsibility. Vincible, which means it's conquerable, you can overcome it, is the kind of ignorance that is self-induced. So the kind of ignorance we're talking about here is the someone who refuses to look at what the speed limit on the road is, even though it's right there. They refuse to look. They've trained themselves over time not to look. Right? You can't really do that in Melbourne, I've realized. In Canada, you can, because they don't have speed cameras everywhere. So you can kind of just go with what feels natural. It's very different here. You have to know what the speed limit is because, but there are going to be people out there that have trained themselves not to look at it. And that is self-induced ignorance. They're ignorant of what's the speed limit right now? I don't know. Are they responsible for knowing what it is? Yes, and that's why they get a ticket. There are other examples that could be given. For example, someone who drives over, drinking out of the bar, gets in the car, drives and kills somebody on the streets. They are still morally responsible, even though in that present moment they didn't have control over their body. When they were driving that car, they didn't have control. But when it came to the decision to drink, they had that control. They had the choice, the ability to choose. And if they didn't have the choice in that exact moment, you could step back earlier in time, and they would have had the choice. Here's some examples of this. Is Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." And Abimelech, the king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Now Abimelech had not approached her, and he said, "Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not say to me, 'She is my sister'?" So here we have ignorance on the part of Abimelech. Francis Turretin points to this as an example of invincible ignorance, where Abimelech was working under the assumption that she was not married. And we can point to other examples where, in this case, he is not, in that sense, morally responsible, even though it would have been a sin. Genesis 29. I'm going to ask you, is this invincible or invincible? Is this self-induced ignorance, or is this the kind of ignorance that one cannot overcome? So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. And in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Then you have deceived me." Invincible or invincible? Invincible, because he couldn't have known otherwise. So in that sense, speaking morally, he would not be morally responsible for marrying her, but he is still married to her. You can give some others. This is regarding Lot in Genesis 19. One day the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is no man around here to give us children, as is the custom all over the earth. Let us get our father to drink wine and then sleep with him and preserve our line through our father." So this is disgusting, but it's a moral question. Is Lot morally responsible for getting his daughters pregnant? Pardon? Yes, it is vincible because he chose to get drunk. Therefore, he is still responsible for whatever he does in that state of ignorance, in that state of involuntary action. And we're going to apply this back to be under authority, but you can look at Paul, 1 Timothy 1:13. Francis Turgeon also points to this one. Though formerly I was a blasphemer, persecutor, and insolent opponent, but I received mercy because I had acted ignorantly in unbelief. He had acted ignorantly. So in this sense, there is a kind of invincibility to it. We can also look at Romans 1, right? People are without excuse, right? They are ignorant, but they are without excuse. Why? Because they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. This is a really interesting one. 2 Samuel, where the story of Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, right, bathing on the roof, David sees her, takes her, sleeps with her, impregnates her, sends her home. Uriah who's one of the warriors, comes back and refuses to go in to sleep with his wife. So what does David do? Well, in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. So Joab is a military person there. In the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die. And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place and where he knew were valiant men. And the men of the city came out, and Uriah died. So, who's in this case? We've got three actors, David, Joab, and Uriah. Uriah carries the letter for his own death. Is he morally responsible? He was acting under authority, the authority of David. But he is not committing suicide. Why? Because he was acting in ignorance. If he had known that he was delivering a letter for his own death, would he have delivered it? No. Or maybe. It produces another interesting ethical question. But given that he was under command. Joab, on the other hand, David definitely is morally culpable as the authority. But Joab is a very interesting one because on the one hand, we want to say, yes, he seems to be aware of the fact that he is supposed to bring him so that he can die. Now, we don't get all the details. We don't know why, what Joab's response to Joab asked David what this was about. Was this a command from God to do this? Why is this the case? Joab, being a soldier, at least as according to the text, just delivers this and just responds to the letter and obeys. And so I think, likely he is morally responsible entirely for this, but not to the same degree as David, because David knew that the intention was murder rather than just killing. Killing is not murder in itself, whereas killing someone that is innocent is. So, what I want to end with is this, is thinking about when you choose, as someone who is under authority, to obey and to submit and to trust that authority, there is safety in that, right? There is safety in that if, you're trying to decide, for example, where to send your kids to school. Should you send them to school or should you homeschool them? And if you're going to send them to school, where do you send them, right? Insofar as the person in authority is the one making that decision, and you are having to trust them that you don't fully understand, there's a greater degree of safety for you. And this is the nature of, in particular, the husband and wife relation, is that there is that covering, there is that safety. For those who are in authority, you bear the responsibility before God and before man. And this is weighty when we think about the kinds of decisions that must be made throughout our life, right? We're going to spiritual life, well-being of our children. So we'll close it there. Any questions? Yes?
What of delegating authority? Are you still having your authority usurped when you allow someone else to... Oh, microphone. Hello. Is this working?
Delegated
hello.
authority?
Oh, very loud now.
Yeah.
So what of delegating authority? Is it still a usurping of authority when you allow someone else to do the creating of options, deciding between the options and then carrying it out?
Is it a usurping of authority?
When you allow someone else to make that process, when you are meant to be an authority there. Let's say I'm an authority regarding, let's say, ideally in the future I'm married, and then I come to make a decision, but I say, cool, could you actually decide this? like I'm really, really busy. I've got work at this exact point in time. Like
If what ends up
Yeah.
happening is that it ends up being a bad decision, then you're still responsible. Because just in the same way that an employer has an employee, and they have this employee, and they're kind of like, they think they've vetted them well for the job, they put them in responsibility over certain affairs of the business. Turns out they're a crook, they try to steal money. The person who hired them, put them in place, is still responsible because they failed to. Not always. I mean, there is degrees here, but insofar as they could have been able to know that that person lacked the kind of character, was the kind of person capable of it, then they don't. But this is why, like, lots of heads rolls at CEO levels, right? Because even though it's someone way down the chain that made a really bad decision, like this Bud Light thing, did the top dog at Bud Light, at the owner company, know? I don't know. But if they didn't, right, that's an interesting question about who's responsible. Definitely the person who did the ad, but they should have done a better job hiring. So when it comes to natural authority and delegated authority, we'll talk more about that next week because we're out of time. But any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, but it wasn't. How is speculative wisdom knowledge on account of authority? I believe that's what the slide said.
Mm-hmm.
I don't quite understand that. As in, like, it can't be any other way.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter that, like, my dad told me this. It's like, yeah.
Well, in that case, you're not the one having the wisdom. You're trusting. Now, there is prudence and wisdom in trusting good authorities. Those who trust good authorities are prudent and wise. And we'll talk about that next week. But yeah, so pi, for example, if you don't know what that is, that's an immutable truth. You can't change that with regards to pi, according to the way God has created the world. But you don't understand why. So in that sense, you don't have wisdom about that particular case. You don't have scientific knowledge, but you do have a kind of knowledge which we call opinion or faith.
But if you did have that scientific knowledge, then it wouldn't be from authority?
It wouldn't be an authority. Now that an authority can bring that knowledge to you by teaching you, instructing you, you have to first accept the authority of the person and trust them to instruct you. And as you learn about this mathematical principles behind this, then you yourself can be brought into knowledge. And that's actually when we talk about growing in our faith, we're talking about growing in understanding, growing in our knowledge. We want to, Augustine says, faith seeking understanding. We start with faith and then we move to understanding. We're trying to grow in understanding about what we believe and why we believe it. Did you have a question?
Well, I could just ask it in this way, but I feel like there might be some explanation needed. How can we not be rationalists in an understanding of authority and knowledge regarding our ability to make a choice? Because if we require being persuaded in order to have responsibility for an action and authority, then does that not mean that we are the ultimate authority in our lives and all things that we do and reason to, and that every single time we make a choice, it's solely based on our own authority?
So, how are we not rationalists? If I understand the question right, how are we not rationalists if all decision making comes back to ultimately our own reasoning?
Effectively, if we say that every single time we are responsible for something, whether that be in terms of blessing or cursing for that action, we require our own persuasion of our own intellect, that we are able to reach the point to say, yes, I am this. Does that make us the ultimate, like, as in at the very end of every single line of decision comes us when we reason and say, we are the ones who make this choice? Right? So on the matter, for example, of Christian faith, is it God that grants us faith, or do we look at this and then make the choice separate from Him? Like, where does the authority in that responsibility lie? Like, I hope I
so it's
made sense.
completely
I don't know.
different when it comes to saving faith. So saving faith, and this, it's an important question to ask. When it comes to, for example, believing something, like if I come to you and I say, okay, this is how you play hockey, right? As a Canadian, this is what you got to do to play hockey. You know, you're gonna trust me, okay? But that trust is in itself a kind of an assent. It's you're choosing to trust. You don't have to trust. Now, when it comes to saving faith, the way we understand saving faith is different. It's it's passive. It's a receiving of what is the case, and it's not a reasoning about. It's not like a reasoning, a rationalizing of, is the gospel true and do I accept it? Because for someone who has a new heart, who's been regenerated, the Holy Spirit is the principle of their belief. It is, in that sense, self-evident to the believer. I believe it. Why do you believe it? It's self-evident. To even ask, why do you believe it, is to ask, almost in some sense, the wrong question. The Holy Spirit is why I believe it. I have a new heart. So it's not the same kind of belief, and that's why I distinguished it earlier. Regular common faith versus saving faith, it's distinct because they have different accounts for why they are there. When it comes to just common faith, there's an account of that, which is you have to go through a decision-making process, either very quickly or over a long period of time. In regards to saving faith, the reason why you come to believe is not because of your own reasoning about the fact. It's about the fact that the Holy Spirit is giving you a new heart, and now that becomes self-evidently true. Anyways, perfect. Okay, well, let's close because we got the service coming on soon.